Nobody saw it coming when Kash Patel tried to take down Denzel Washington on national television. What seemed like just another tense congressional hearing quickly turned into a moment the nation wouldn't forget. The atmosphere was electric, the kind of silence that settles just before something explosive happens. Cameras rolled, eyes locked forward, and the air felt thick with anticipation inside the hearing room, with its polished wood panels and staged political theater. Aides, lawmakers and journalists filled every seat, waiting for sparks to fly. At the heart of the unfolding drama sat two very different men. On one side was Kash Patel, a former Trump aide turned media provocateur, leaning into the microphone with a smirk he didn't bother hiding. Opposite him sat Denzel Washington, calm and steady, projecting quiet strength. He hadn't come to perform. He came to take a stand. Patel leaned forward, cleared his throat like an actor warming up, and then delivered the blow. "Why don't you just go back to the zoo?" The room stopped. Not a single breath. A few aides looked up, stunned. A pen hit the floor. One person exhaled like they'd just been gut-punched. Denzel remained still. He didn't blink, didn't react. But Patel wasn't done. With smug confidence, he brushed imaginary lint from his jacket and pressed on, his voice taking on a syrupy arrogance. "Mr. Washington, we're here to discuss serious issues, law, order, national values, so you'll have to excuse me if I'm struggling to understand why a Hollywood actor is sitting before this committee." He tossed out a shrug, more theater than sincerity. "Outside of your dramatic speeches and Twitter rants, maybe you can help me out here. Was your background in makeup and lighting, or did you specialize in social media branding before deciding to play politics?" The insult wasn't subtle, it was bait and a trap. Patel glanced at the cameras, playing to them now. "Some of us earned our stripes through years in national security and legal service. Others woke up famous because they threw a tantrum on TikTok." He paused for a reaction. Nothing, just dead silence. So he pushed harder. "Tell me, Mr. Washington, what matters more to you? Defending the Constitution or perfecting your Instagram profile?" It wasn't a question. It was an ambush, a calculated attempt to diminish Denzel into a stereotype, just another celebrity with a microphone and no substance. But Denzel didn't rush to respond. He let the silence stretch, uncomfortable and deliberate. The insult was allowed to breathe, to linger, until no one in the room could pretend they hadn't heard it. Then, without raising his voice or making a single dramatic move, Denzel leaned forward. His tone was firm, measured, and cutting. "Mr. Patel," he said, folding his hands with composure, "I understand your confusion. It's difficult to recognize integrity when you've never had to live by it." Heads began to turn. A low murmur swept through the chamber, not loud, but unmistakable. The balance of the room had shifted. Denzel's tone never changed, but the temperature did. "Since you're curious about my background," he continued, steady and direct, "let me fill in what your research conveniently overlooked." He laid it out with clarity. He'd earned degrees in both theater and criminal justice, while Patel had been maneuvering through political appointments and DC galas. Denzel had been walking into courtrooms, sitting with kids facing time for crimes they hadn't committed. He'd consoled families torn apart by policy failures. He'd mentored young men discarded by a justice system that judged their skin long before it ever saw their story. His eyes locked onto Patel, unwavering. "Maybe you built your reputation shaking hands in Washington's back rooms," he said. "I built mine by looking broken men in the eye, the kind no one else would fight for." A quiet ripple moved through the hearing chamber. One lawmaker gave a subtle nod. The momentum was turning. Denzel wasn't finished. "As for social media," he added, "I use mine to educate, to strip away the spin, which is ironic, since some people in this room seem to have made a career out of spreading it." Patel shifted in his seat, that smirk from earlier gone. Denzel leaned forward only slightly and delivered the next lines with surgical precision. "You questioned my qualifications," he said, his voice smooth and certain. "So let's talk about them." No dramatics, no raised voice, just plain truth delivered like a closing argument. He'd questioned witnesses under oath. He'd studied the law, not just in textbooks, but in real rooms where decisions meant life or death. He'd helped write legislation. He'd stood in places where no one clapped and cameras were nowhere in sight, only consequences. He paused, just long enough. "So let me ask you, Mr. Patel, when was the last time you cross-examined a witness, not on cable news, but in a real courtroom in front of a judge? When was the last time you stood beside someone whose life depended on justice, not ratings?" The silence in the chamber was no longer awkward. It was focused, intentional. All eyes turned toward Patel. His body language shifted, if only slightly. Denzel didn't let up. "If this is all just performance to you, another opportunity to trade, insults and sound bites, then maybe you should reread the job description." The room was no longer just an audience. It had become a jury. From somewhere in the gallery, a faint voice whispered, "Damn." It cut through the quiet like a gavel. The moment landed hard. Kash Patel glanced down. He tapped the desk once, then again. He opened his mouth, searching for something sharp to fire back, but nothing came out. Denzel calmly folded his hands. "I didn't show up for applause," he said, his voice low. "I came for the truth. If that makes me a target, so be it. I've faced worse, I've fought harder, and I'm still here." He let that truth settle in the air, but the silence didn't hold. Patel's pride couldn't stand the weight. The smug grin returned, thinner now, forced. He leaned into the microphone again, a trace of bitterness beneath his words. "You know, Mr. Washington," he said with faint amusement, "it's always amusing when people parade their past around like a badge, like standing next to criminals makes you some kind of hero." He turned slightly toward the spectators, trying to reclaim the crowd. "But hey," he said, "when you've spent your career defending felons, I guess it's hard to understand what the rest of us are trying to protect." Gasps echoed softly across the room. Patel wasn't done. "You talk about law and integrity. Fine. Let's talk about the people you've chosen to stand up for. Assault charges, drug trafficking, robbery." He listed them like accusations, not cases. "Are they misunderstood victims too?" Patel sneered, the sarcasm thick. "Or is injustice just easier to cry when it fits your script?" Denzel didn't flinch. His expression barely changed, but his eyes narrowed. He'd seen this move coming long before Patel played it. With a flourish, Patel flipped through a few printed pages and held one high like a courtroom prop. "And then there's your social media," he said, voice rising slightly, as he held up a tweet calling the justice system rigged. "Theater. That's the same system you're here claiming to respect." He paused, waiting, hoping for hesitation, for a stumble, for a crack in the composure. But Denzel leaned forward, calm, unbothered. His voice was quiet, deliberate. "Let me save you the trouble, Mr. Patel," he said evenly. "Yes," I said. "The system is rigged, and I stand by it." A subtle tension swept through the room. "I don't say that out of hate for the system," he continued. "I say it because I've seen it from the inside. I've watched one teenager get 15 years for carrying weed, while someone else walks free after laundering millions." He let that truth sink in. That's not justice. That's arithmetic based on who can afford the better lawyer. Patel's eyebrows lifted in feigned shock, but Denzel kept going without pause. "You think that makes me anti-law?" he asked, steady as stone. "I'm not against law. I'm against inequality, against a system that punishes poverty harder than it punishes crime." He leaned in slightly. "If that sounds radical to you, maybe the issue isn't with my values. Maybe it's with yours." This time, the whispers from the gallery lasted longer, deeper. the kind that signaled discomfort, not just with what had been said, but with what it revealed. Even a few panel members seemed uneasy now. Denzel turned, not to Patel, but to the room, to the people who had been silently watching. "As for those I've stood beside," he said, his voice lower but resolute, "I didn't choose them for image or convenience. I stood with them because no one else would. I defended them because they were human beings, because they had rights, because I took an oath, one I didn't trade in for likes, headlines, or a book deal." That line cut sharp, and it was meant to. Across the room, Patel froze. The printed tweet in his hand crumpled slightly as his fingers tensed. His mouth opened to fire back, but nothing came out. The moment had shifted, and Denzel didn't wait. "I don't run from my record," he said. "I wear it. Every case, every courtroom, every person I've stood beside, that's what shaped me. That's what sharpened me. That's what made me a real threat to the systems that depend on silence." He turned his gaze back to Patel, calm but direct. "So, if your strategy is to shame people for doing the hard work of justice, maybe you're not here to protect democracy. Maybe you're here to distract from it." This time the ripple in the room was audible. Nods replaced glances. Murmurs turned to murmured agreements. Aides scribbled notes faster now. Something had changed. Denzel didn't chase the moment. He folded his hands, his voice dropped, steady, and measured, but every word hit its mark. "I've been underestimated my whole life," he said, voice steady. "Because I'm a black man, because I came from a working-class family, because I speak plainly, even when the truth makes people uncomfortable." He looked around the room, unflinching. "But what you failed to understand," he said, locking eyes with Patel, "is that everything you've tried to weaponize against me, my background, my voice, my fight, is exactly what qualifies me to sit in this chair." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was electric, like the room itself had stopped breathing. Then, in a desperate play to take back control, Patel made his move, a calculated gamble. He leaned forward, voice cool, laced with academic condescension. "Well," Patel said with a thin smile, "since you've cast yourself as a champion of justice and legal nuance, why don't you walk us through the implications of Marbury versus Madison in the context of modern executive overreach?" He paused, letting the weight of the question hang. "Or is that a little beyond your expertise?" A few eyebrows lifted in the crowd. Classic academic ambush. Drop a dense, loaded question and hope for a stumble, hope for silence, hope the other man chokes under pressure. Patel crossed his arms, already savoring what he thought was a win, but Denzel didn't even blink. He leaned back, casual, calm, almost amused. Then came the slow, quiet smile, not smug, not theatrical, just confident. "You mean the 1803 decision?" Denzel replied, "where Chief Justice John Marshall established judicial review, giving the court the power to strike down laws and executive actions it deems unconstitutional." A flicker crossed Patel's face. Not a collapse, just a crack, and the room saw it, but Denzel wasn't finished. "Yes, it was a landmark case, but if you think it was only about power, you've missed the entire point." He leaned forward, voice quiet but commanding. It was about integrity, about balance, about responsibility. Marshall didn't invent authority. He earned it through reason and restraint. The energy in the room shifted again. "You brought it up to trap me," Denzel said, "to turn this into a law school debate. But this isn't a classroom. This is real life." He gestured subtly to the room around them. "And out here, quoting case law doesn't protect people. Understanding it does. Applying it responsibly does. I'm not here to perform. I'm here to get it right." Silence. Real silence. Not from tension, but from respect. Patel's jaw clenched. His hands twitched slightly, reaching for another line, but there was nothing left that wouldn't feel small now. Denzel leaned in, just slightly. "And let's be clear, Mr. Patel," he said, voice low, deliberate. When you throw Marbury versus Madison at me like a trivia question, hoping I'll slip, remember who you're talking to. I'm not a pundit. I'm not a podcast lawyer who never stepped into a courtroom. He paused just long enough. I've lived this. I've studied this. I've practiced this. I've stood in real courtrooms, argued real motions, fought real battles for people whose names never made the headlines. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. This isn't theory to me, he said. This is lived experience. The gasp that came wasn't performative. It was instinctive, a shared realization rippling through the crowd. Something real had just happened. Denzel continued, voice just a shade firmer now. And if you're going to test someone, he said, maybe don't pick the guy who spent his life answering harder questions under heavier pressure than this. Across the table, Kash Patel shrank, not dramatically but visibly. His shoulders lowered, his confidence deflated. His carefully arranged stack of papers sat untouched. And for the first time since the hearing began, he wasn't smiling. The third audience, no longer passive, was present, engaged, awake. The balance of the room had shifted for good. The murmurs grew, first a few nods, then light applause, scattered, unsure. But it rose. Not loud, not theatrical, just real, earned. Not for the spectacle, but for the precision. Denzel hadn't just passed the test. He had turned the test around, rewritten it, and handed it back to the examiner. He let the moment breathe, his eyes moving slowly across the room, from the panel to the staffers, to the aides, and even the live stream text tucked in the corner. Every eye was on him now. Then calmly, deliberately, he adjusted the microphone. "By the way," Denzel said, "if we're done with the pop quizzes, maybe we can talk about actual policy." A ripple of laughter broke out, not awkward, not polite, but relieved, cathartic. But Denzel wasn't done. Just as the room began to settle, he leaned forward again, eyes locking on Patel. "I think the American people deserve one more truth." And once again, the air shifted. Not a mic. Drop a reckoning.